Joseph was one of 12 sons of Jacob, and Joseph was his dad's favourite. His dad was so pleased with him that he gave him a special gift to prove it. It was a richly decorated, multicoloured coat. You can imagine that getting this coat made his brothers very jealous. But Joseph only made things worse. He told his brothers about dreams he had, where he was ruling over them. This made all his brothers furious. "You're ruling over us," they said. "What a joke!" One day, when the brothers were out working, they decided to get rid of Joseph. So they threw him into a pit, and they might have just left him there. But then they met some men travelling to Egypt, so they decided to sell Joseph to them as a servant instead. Then the brothers went home, and they told their dad that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal. Well, this broke their dad Jacob's heart. But the Bible says that God was with Joseph. When he was a servant, he worked for an important rich man called Potiphar. Now, Potiphar liked Joseph so much that he put him in charge of his whole household. Joseph was very happy, and he worked really hard. But then one day, he was blamed for doing something that he didn't do. Potiphar's wife had told lies about him. Well, Potiphar believed his wife and sent Joseph straight to jail. But God was still with Joseph, and the guard decided to put him in charge of the other prisoners. Joseph continued to work hard, and God gave Joseph special knowledge about dreams. So when the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were put in prison with Joseph, and they had dreams, Joseph knew what their dreams were about and what they meant, and so he told them. Well, 2 years later, Egypt's ruler, the Pharaoh, had a dream too, and no one knew what it meant. The cupbearer was now out of jail, and he remembered Joseph and how he had helped him understand his dream. So the cupbearer went to Pharaoh and told him. Joseph was brought before Pharaoh, and with God's help, he told Pharaoh what his dreams meant. The dreams warned that everyone in Egypt would have plenty of food for 7 years, but then there'd be a food shortage for another 7 years. Joseph told the Pharaoh the only way to survive was to store some of the food during the 7 good years of harvest. Pharaoh thought Joseph's idea was brilliant, so he put him in charge of the food. They saved up food, just like God had suggested to Joseph. And so when the 7 hungry years came, so that no one could eat, they had to go and get food from Joseph. Now you remember Joseph's 11 brothers? Like everyone else, they had to travel to Egypt and get food from him too. And when they arrived in Egypt, they didn't recognize their brother. But Joseph knew who they were. At first, he said nothing. He kept one of them in jail, sent them back to get their youngest brother, and even tried to trick them by putting his silver cup in one of their food bags. Finally, he couldn't hide who he was from his brothers anymore, and so he told them, "I'm your brother, Joseph. I'm the one you sold." The brothers couldn't believe it. They had hurt Joseph, but God had taken care of him during the good times and the bad times. And even with everything that his brothers had done to him, Joseph forgave them. He said, "You planned to harm me, but God planned it for good." And so Joseph was reunited with his dad, who, along with the 11 brothers and their families, then came to live in Egypt with Joseph.